Perfect.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all about this. And this is a talk I've given in a couple other places before, and I like it because it gives me the opportunity to go a little deeper in invasive species stuff than I often do. So I'm going to turn my video off so you can see my full screen. And then I'll just get right into it. And so I'm gonna work off a little bit of an assumptions because again, I'm going beyond those basics, going a little deeper. So I'm assuming that everybody here knows what an invasive species is, right? We kind of know what they are when we talk about an invasive, and we all pretty much agree that we need to control invasive species. But then I'm also assuming that not everybody is familiar with some of these basics of invasive species control. So I'm going to go over those. And then when we talk about woody invasives, I'm assuming everybody knows what we talk about when we say a woody plant or a woody invasive plant. If you do want to get a lot more information on the basics about invasive species control and woody invasive species control, we do have a lot of videos on our YouTube channel. So you can just search for Illinois Extension Forestry in YouTube, or you can use this QR code or that link and go there. And there's a lot of invasive species stuff in there, including some really detailed videos about the introduction to invasives, how to treat woody invasives, some basic control techniques. And so there's a lot of information there. And we do deal with a lot of invasives in Illinois, right? So we have a lot of woody ones. A lot of you are probably familiar with some of these, like autumn olive, that's in our open areas and forest edges. I would be willing to bet that almost everybody's familiar with amber honeysuckle or bush honeysuckle, a very big invasive. And we have others that you may or may not know, but things like burning bush, which most people are familiar with as an ornamental, but can be very invasive in certain cases. We have woody trees like tree of heaven that certainly are a problem, and woody vines like round leaf bittersweet, right? So a lot of different woodies, and the stuff that I'm talking about today can really apply to about any of these. Some more that are kind of new on the landscape would be things like Japanese barberry. And of course, the new one people talk a lot about, colliery pear, right? So very, very common on the landscape, unfortunately now, but a lot of different woody invasives. And so it doesn't matter if you're working in wetland systems, in prairies, in forest, there's certainly woody plants that we tend to manage. So working off that assumption that we may not all be familiar with some of the management techniques, I want to start this by just going over an overview of the different kind of techniques that we use when we're controlling woody invasive plants. And I'll start with the most basic, kind of hand pulling and work my way up through the techniques and just kind of try to cover them in detail. And so that first one is indeed hand pulling. The nice thing about hand pulling invasives is you don't require really any tools except for gloves. When you are hand pulling, you need to be sure to get the entire root system, which can be difficult in dry soil conditions. You can pile or remove the plants if the seeds are present, and you got to expect a little bit of regrowth or germination, so you definitely want to follow up. Hand pulling works well for small diameter woody plants, very, something the size of a pencil or so that has a small enough root system. Some plants like honeysuckle have very shallow roots, and it's easier to pull those than others, but it certainly is an option for smaller woody invasive plants. As they get larger and you still want to pull them, you need to look at something like one of these mechanical pulling aids. These would be, some people call them weed wrenches or other things, and basically they're a tool that gives you some level of a mechanical advantage using a lever, all right, to pull them out. They've got all funny names. There's uprooters, extractigators, puller bears, all these weird things. But again, they all kind of work the same. They have a long handle and then some kind of claw at the base to grip the invasive. And it lets you really get a lot more force by that long handle. You get so much leverage that you can pull bigger things out with one of these. They are pretty heavy and they can wear you out by using them, but they certainly have their place and they work really well on things that are just a bit bigger than you can get with your hands. And so those are some of the mechanical options. Let's talk about the chemical options. So this is when you're using herbicides to control invasive woody plants. Anytime you are using herbicides, you want to make sure that you're, of course, being safe. So you want to use the appropriate protective gear. So that could be often things like eye protection, long sleeves and pants, closed-toed shoes, and chemical-safe gloves. But each herbicide will have its own required protective equipment, and so you always have to read and follow the label on those. And that's any kind of herbicide you're using. But there's certainly some techniques that we use pretty frequently with invasive woody plants. One would be just a basic foliar spray. So that's where you are spraying a dilute formulation of herbicide onto the leaves of the plant. And then the leaves would then absorb that herbicide and translocate it in throughout the plant and eventually kill the plant. Um, so this is one that, again, you're applying that dilute solution of herbicide. It's very, very low concentration. So you want to make sure you get thorough coverage on the leaves, but you don't want to spray it so heavily that it runs off and starts dripping. And of course, your foliage should be green and actively grow, and you want a healthy leaf to be able to take up the herbicide. Since you are spraying that in the air on the leaves, you got to watch for non-target impacts, and anything that's close to it may catch some herbicide via overspray. It's good for smaller plants. I wouldn't use foliar treatments on anything, more than about 6 feet tall, because then otherwise you're spraying it up into the air, and your chance of getting the herbicide on you or getting the herbicide on other plants increases. Probably the most common technique we use when controlling woody invasive plants is the cut stump treatment, or sometimes called a cut surface treatment. And that's literally where you cut the plant down close to the ground, and then you treat that surface of that stump with a concentrated herbicide. So this is not dilute like foliar spray, but a concentrated herbicide. So it's much stronger, but you use just a little bit of it right onto that cut surface and let it go into there and kill the roots of the system, or the root system of the plant. Now, for cut stump treatments, in general, water-based solutions are more effective, especially during the summer and fall treatments. They tend to get taken up more readily into those cut surfaces. And then even in winter, you can use those if it's above freezing. Uh, Otherwise, you use an oil-based solution, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's different herbicides, some you mix with water and some you mix with oil. You can use those in freezing temperatures in the winter. Regardless, you want to treat the entire surface of small stems. So if the stem is like 2 inches diameter or less, you just go ahead and put the herbicide across the whole surface. As it gets larger, you really only have to treat that outer 1 inch. You're trying to treat the area that has the phloem in there and the cambial layer, because that phloem is going to help take that herbicide down into the root system. Adding an herbicide dye really helps because you can track what you've treated and what you haven't. And the big thing with cut stump treatments is you want to do them fairly immediately after cutting that plant, because as you cut the plant, within 10 to 15 minutes or so, that plant really starts shutting down those damaged cells right at the cut surface. And then they no longer take up the herbicide as well. So if you wait an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and then treat them, you're going to have less success than if you cut and treat within those 10 to 15 minutes. Some of the another common technique we use when controlling woody invasive plants with herbicides is a basal bark treatment. And so a basal bark is similar to a cut stump, but instead of cutting the plant down, you're actually applying the herbicide straight to the bark of the woody plant and letting it penetrate through the bark and kill the plant that way. You have to use one of these oil-based, or we call ester herbicides because they're really the only ones that'll be able to penetrate through that bark. And it should be, a fairly thin barked species, something that doesn't have very corky, heavy bark because that'll slow the uptake of the herbicide. When you're using a basil bark, you're applying that herbicide directly to the stem from the ground up to about 12 inches high. You want to get all the sides and every stem. It does use more herbicide than a cut stump, but you don't have to mess with cutting the plants down and dealing with the slash and everything. And the the kind of last section of these different treatment types are these stem injections. And so this is one that probably people are less familiar with. And so stem injections are kind of halfway between a basil bark and a cut stump. You're not actually cutting the entire plant down, but you're also not relying on the herbicide to penetrate through the bark. What you do is use one of several techniques to make a small site of damage to the stem of that woody plant, and that's kind of bypassing the bark. And then you put that concentrated herbicide right into that damaged site, and then it really helps focus the herbicide right into that phloem layer where it's best taken up, and you bypass the bark, so you don't have to worry about trying to have an herbicide that's going to penetrate and have to work its way through that bark. And there's three different types of these injection applications that are commonly used. One is called a girdle or a frill application. Another one's called hack and squirt, and then the newer one is called drill and fill. They're all basically the same thing, but some of the tools are a little different with them. But they all share the basic design of this small damage site. A girdle, or what we call a frill cut, is one where you're basically cutting completely around the stem of the plant, deep enough to get through the entire bark, so you're exposing all the way down to the sapwood of the plant. And then you're directing that spray of herbicide right into that whole cut surface around the entire circumference of the plant. And you want to make sure that it's deep enough to get past the bark and also wide enough. You want to make sure that the girdle is wide enough so the plant can't kind of grow over the girdle, which they sometimes can do if you don't use enough herbicide. This works best on larger stems, 6 inches or more. The smaller stems are just kind of hard to girdle without actually cutting them down. Hack and squirt is kind of what it sounds like. You're taking a downward chop with a machete or an axe or some other tool into the bark. And so you're cutting through the bark and exposing the wood below, and then you're putting that herbicide right into that wound site. You can kind of leave the hatchet in there so it helps you direct the spray right down into the cut surface. And then we definitely like the downward angle because it kind of creates an an up cut so that it holds the herbicide in there when you treat it. Here's a colleague of mine making the chops on the left right before I treated with the herbicide with a little squirt bottle on the right. So you can see it's really easy. It doesn't require a lot of tools, just a hatchet and a squirt bottle, but can be very, very effective. And then another one we're moving to lately is very, very similar. It's what we call drill and fill. And basically, it's the same as hack and squirt, but instead of swinging an axe or a machete, you're using a cordless drill to drill a hole at a downward angle into the bark. And so we usually use around a half-inch drill bit, and you want to go 1.5 to 2 inches deep. And then you put the herbicide, a little squirt, about a milliliter squirt of herbicide into each of those holes. And the number of holes that you put into the plant kind of depends on the herbicide you use and how big it is, with bigger plants usually requiring more holes be drilled in there. But it can be extremely effective. So we use this one quite a bit. And in fact, all three of those stem treatments, the girdle, the hack and squirt, and the drill and fill, you can all expect 80+% mortality, which means 8 out of every 10 trees that you do this with should die after 2 years. It is a little bit of a slow treatment, which means that often in 1 year after it, the plants will still be holding on a little bit. And so it may take another growing season to finally kill them. And in fact, I think we found in one study we did, um, I think about two-thirds of them died after 1 year, and then it bumped up to over 80% after 2 years. So be patient if you're using stem treatments. All righty, so that's the basic kind of review of some of these control techniques, and these can be used throughout the year. But really, what we're talking about today is fall and winter control. So I did want to move into this idea of what is unique about controlling invasive woody plants in fall and winter. I like this picture. This is a picture of a native tree black gum in kind of full fall color. So I thought that was kind of neat to highlight fall. But there's a few things that make controlling invasive plants in fall and winter a little different and then kind of you need to consider. And so I'll go over the unique ones and then we'll cover each one in detail after that. And that'll really make kind of the heart of my presentation. But the first one is plants are shutting down or are already dormant in the fall and winter. They're not actively growing. Many of them aren't. And now that's both native plants and invasive plants. And that does give us some opportunities and some limitations. So we'll talk about it in a little bit. The next unique thing is most of our invasive plants have already produced viable fruit for that year. And so that definitely needs to be considered when you're controlling invasive plants, but especially needs to be considered when you're concerned about accidentally moving invasive plants around. Again, we'll get into that into detail. The third unique feature would be there's certainly possibility of freezing temperatures and even snow cover in the winter. We're going to experience a little bit of that this weekend. And so that changes what you can and can't use. And certainly the freezing temperature limits a little bit of your herbicide choices. And lastly, animal nesting is generally over at that time of year. They're not nesting, and many reptiles and amphibians, in fact, are hibernating this time of year and are in their dens. And so this does give us some options to use some bigger techniques like forestry mulching, where you're grinding things down and you generally don't have to worry about animal nest or impacting turtles or reptiles on the ground. The same goes with prescribed fire. Again, we'll get into that as well. Well, let's cover each one of these one at a time, and let's start back at the top with these plants are shutting down and or are dormant at this time of year. So in that case, that limits the use of those foliar applications of herbicide if you're far enough along into fall or into winter when the foliage of your target plant is turning colors or has already dropped, right? So when that happens, obviously, spraying the foliage as a foliage spray is not going to be an option, right? The good thing about some of these invasive plants is they have what is called an extended leaf phenology, which just simply means that they stay green a lot longer into the fall than many of our native plants. And even some of our invasive plants tend to be what we call semi-evergreen, which they stay green well into winter, if not all the way through winter. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to treat these at the right time as long as their foliage is in good condition to get some selectivity. If they're the only green things in the woods, then we can treat with a foliar spray and not worry about impacting our native species, which have already gone dormant. But again, it's vital that you make sure that the leaves are in good condition and able to take up that herbicide before you spray them. So here are four different fall pictures of bush honeysuckle, fall and winter pictures that show four definitely different stages of shutting down for the plant. So the first one, absolutely, you could use foliar spray on that one. The leaves are dark green. They look healthy. They're likely actively photosynthesizing still at that point. So a foliar spray, or you spraying the foliage, the leaves with herbicide is certainly an option. The rest of these three are not, right? The second one is yellowing. There's still a lot of green, but you see all of this yellow, which means that plant has already metabolized most of its chlorophyll, and the plant is not replenishing the chlorophyll in the leaves. So it is no longer actively photosynthesizing or not much. So it's going to have a very impaired ability to take up that herbicide um, and translocate it to kill that plant. And of course, the next two are even further along in that. So evaluate the situation before you decide whether you can spray the foliage or not. And in fact, here's a picture of some honeysuckle. This is past it, we call it. Too yellowed, starting to lose its leaves a bit, and it's not really suitable for a foliar application. And the same goes here with this roundleaf bittersweet, right? You see how it's already starting to change color and not really the best situation for controlling it using a foliar spray. You would want to shift to some of those other treatment options. But again, many of these species do remain kind of really healthy, green, and actively growing way longer than a lot of our other species, and especially our native species. So oftentimes we have a several week window in the fall where you can control these invasive species where nothing else or very little else is growing. And this is a great look at it with this picture. You can see I have a couple of honeysuckle plants there that are the only green thing in this whole woods. And here's looking up through a canopy of honeysuckle, and you can see the trees above it have already lost all their leaves, or nearly lost their leaves, but the honeysuckle itself is definitely green and going well. Same thing here. This is plants are starting to shut down. There's still quite a bit of leaves left on the trees behind these plants, but they are fading fast. But the autumn olive in the foreground is certainly green and able to be controlled. And so just a list of some of the plants that have invasive plants that have an extended leaf phenology. So we see this a lot on our bush honeysuckles, common buckthorn and glossy buckthorn, autumn olive, and even Callery pear will have a bit of a extended leaf phenology. So those do definitely lose their leaves in the fall, early winter, but they tend to hold on to them a little longer than our natives. And then we have a number of invasive plants that are true evergreens or what we consider semi-evergreens. And the difference is a true evergreen will consistently keep its leaves, green leaves on it all year long. And a semi-evergreen loses most of its leaves, may lose all of its leaves, but in general, oftentimes it'll hold at least some green leaves well into winter, if not completely through winter. And so winter creeper, English ivy, and vinca are three evergreen invasive plants. And then Japanese honeysuckle, which is the viney one, and privet are what we call semi-evergreen, which they do lose their leaves. They're not true evergreens, but they really hold on to them for quite a while. And so, again, this leaf phenology is being used by a lot of landowners when they have really problematic stands of these invasive species, large stands of them. It gives you an option to do kind of bigger scale treatments, broadcast applications. And so this picture here, pretty much everything green in this picture has honeysuckle on it. And so what we're seeing with some landowners are aerial applications with drones. And you can see the drone here above the trees, and then all the green honeysuckle in the understory of the forest. And so this is a situation where the drone can spray the herbicide. It can work its way through and not really impact the trees, but still impact the honeysuckle below. So that's just one option for very thick stands where you have lots of honeysuckle, or some of these other invasives that have extended leaf phenology like autumn olive, and it gives you a chance to control them while retaining some, you know, selectivity for your native plants that won't impact your native plants. Just one option I see some landowners using. All right, the next one of those unique things that we mentioned was most invasive plants have already produced viable fruit for that year when we're looking at fall and winter. And so that really makes you as a manager of controlling these invasives, you can need to take measures to not spread those seeds around when you're doing your control work. Now that could be not spreading the seeds of the invasive plants that you're killing, those woody plants, but also other invasive species so that you're not accidentally moving something around an herbaceous invasive. And this involves cleaning equipment so you're not moving stuff around on equipment, cleaning shoes, making sure you're not dragging anything in the soles of your shoes, monitoring areas to make sure that no invasives pop up. Or when you're cutting an invasive that has seed on it, a lot of people pile those cut stems into one area. So you're kind of concentrating the seeds all in one place. So it's easier to come back the next year and control any seedlings that might come up. Now, the good thing is that most of these invasive plants, the woody plants that we deal with, have a relatively short-lived seed bank. So they're not going to stick around for a long time. Most of them are 1 to 2 years, but there's a few like multiflora rose and Sericea lespedeza that have a very long life and can live decades in the soil, unfortunately. So any of those in general, you want to make sure that you clean your equipment after you're working in an invaded area. If you're mowing or using equipment, use a leaf blower or a pressure washer or something and get the mud, get the duff off of that because that could certainly harbor seeds. Also, pay attention to your own clothing. Some of the invasive herbaceous plants that we worry about here in southern Illinois, like chafflower, but across the state, there's others. We don't want to accidentally be dragging those around as we're doing our woody invasive control and accidentally spreading these. And so there's a number of them, right? These are just a small list of some of the herbaceous invasive species that are easily spread around either on equipment or clothing. So things like chafflower and stiltgrass, garlic mustard, teasels, hedge parsley, Sericea lespedeza, Johnson grass, and I could just keep listing other ones for sure. But these are ones that you need to be cautious about, and you don't want to be moving them around and causing a big problem with those while you're trying to control other invasive species. And so, as I mentioned earlier, some of those best management practices, if you're concerned about that, controlling these in the fall and the winter, would be to come back the next growing season, look for and monitor the area for new seedlings so that you can control those, concentrating potentially those invasives into small piles so you know where those seeds may drop and you can kind of have a better chance of finding seedlings if they do show up. All right. So the next one of those unique situations will be the possibility of freezing temperatures and snow cover. And as I mentioned, it does impact your herbicide choice and can limit some of your applications. And we mentioned foliar applications. Foliar applications need to have actively photosynthesizing leaves. And that's not very effective, even if the leaves are green at temperatures under 50 degrees. And so even if you have green leaves and it's cold, you may want to not use a foliar application because it will not be most effective. And if it's below freezing, you really can't or shouldn't use water-based herbicides, even for a cut stump treatment, because they tend to freeze to the top surface of that plant, and they're not going to be taken up very effectively. So when it's below freezing, you'd want to switch to an oil-based herbicide, an ester herbicide that you mix in basil oil or one of these other things, because they can be applied in below freezing temperatures and still be effective. Now, there's a little bit of a difference in terms of how you apply those. With a water-based herbicide, you need to treat the entire cut surface on small stems, or like I said earlier, that outer 1 inch for larger stems, and you need to treat within 10 to 15 minutes of cutting. That's kind of the standard recommendations for when you're using a water-based herbicide, which is generally more effective unless it's below freezing. Now, when you're using an oil-based herbicide, you definitely want to treat the entire surface or that outer 1 inch, but you also want to treat it heavy enough that it starts to run down the edge of the bark a little bit around that cut surface. So you're kind of doing a cut surface and a basal bark treatment at the same time. You basically need a little heavier application of these oil-based herbicides. So you're using a little more herbicide. But on the plus side is that you have a longer window following cutting for this. So you can treat usually within a day or two of cutting that plant, and it still be effective. Now, in terms of basal bark applications, if there's a, you can do those certainly in below freezing temperatures because you're using an oil-based herbicide. But if there's a lot of snow on, it tends to limit the effectiveness of that basal bark. So if you got a lot of snow on, if you got really wet stems, the trunk's really wet, basal bark may not be very effective. And similarly, if there's a lot of silt on those stems on that trunk, it may be less effective as well. Now, in general, fall treatments. So if you're doing these things in the fall, the cut stump, the basal bark, the stem injections, all of those we talked about are generally highly effective in fall and winter, though you may want to consider sap flow in mid to late winter as things are starting to warm up. So that sap flowing, and especially late winter, even right now, if you go into southern Illinois, our autumn olive is starting to open it up and starting to already grow new leaves. So that late winter sap flow really limits the effectiveness of those cut stump treatments and those stem injection treatments. They tend to almost push the herbicide out, and you just don't see the same effectiveness. And in fact, we did a little study on this. A few years ago now, but we did some treatments when the sap was flowing. So it was December, it was warm, you cut into these plants and the sap would run out. And we did a bunch of different types of herbicide treatments. And combined after 2 years, we only had 18% mortality across all of our treatments, which is pretty bad, right? Like under two, less than two out of every 10 plants that we treated ended up dying. Now we repeated that same treatments only at a time when the sap wasn't flowing. It was a little earlier in the year. The sap wasn't yet flowing on these plants. And those same treatments, we had 83% mortality. So eight out of every 10 plants we treated died, right? So very, very effective. And the only difference between those two was the timing. It was either late winter and warm when the sap was flowing, or early earlier in the year it was late fall when the sap wasn't flowing, right? So very, very important to make that a consideration when you're doing cut stump and stem injections. And then even in the southern half of the state, I would say we're already at the point where we shouldn't be using those against our woody invasive plants because many of them are already starting to grow here. In another 3 or 4 weeks, where you all are at in the northern part of the state, the same thing will hold true. Alrighty, so the last of those general considerations that I mentioned earlier, the things that are unique about controlling woody invasive plants in fall and winter, is that animal nesting is generally over and many reptiles and amphibians are hibernating. And so this provides opportunities again for that larger scale treatments in heavy infestations. So we're not going to see those impacts to wildlife if they're either absent or dormant and below ground. You want to be sure to be cautious about some of these things in early fall when we still have a lot of these animals on the ground. So this is a little more to consider late fall and into winter, especially with prescribed fire. A lot of our reptiles are kind of sluggish when it starts getting cold. And if they haven't fully hibernated yet, they can be pretty susceptible to prescribed fire. So just understand that like early fall prescribed fires do have some risk of animal impacts. So it's later in the year, after it's cold, it's been cold for a while, those animals are already dormant. That's when you get the safety of some of these techniques. And I wanted to go just a little bit more into detail on this idea of fire and invasive plants. Because some people say it's a wonderful treatment to control all invasive species, and that's not necessarily true. There's a lot of varied results depending on the species, your timing, your intensity of fire. Are you repeating fire? Are you doing other treatments? And so it certainly can be a very important tool, can be very effective at helping you control invasives, but it certainly should be a component of an integrated approach where you're using prescribed fire in combination with other treatments to really be effective. And this is one where we had an early fall treatment in this area. They weren't really concerned about reptiles because it was so heavily invaded with honeysuckle. There wasn't a lot of wildlife use. But an early fall prescribed fire came in and really was pretty effective at knocking back the woody invasives in this case. Now, a lot of these woody invasives after a fire are going to sprout. So here's a couple different honeysuckles, bush honeysuckle that went through a prescribed fire, and you can see both of them are sprouting there. But what it does do is knock them back, make them a little smaller, a little less vigorous. So a repeated fire in a year or two um, may kill some of them, or it's at a point where it's a little more vulnerable and you can come in with a foliar spray or something afterwards. And I thought these were interesting. This is actually an invasive we have in southern Illinois. I don't think up in northern Illinois you really have a problem with this, but it's called princess tree or paulownia, and it sprouts aggressively following fire. And so both of these are 1 year growth of these paulownia trees following a prescribed fire, and they're just a wild tree. And so we kind of pulled together this list of what we call increasers, decreasers, and mixed results with prescribed fire. Increasers are ones that tend to increase their population, do better following a prescribed fire. And so that would be things like stiltgrass, lespedeza, bittersweet, and tree of heaven. We all seem to tend to see worse infestations, thicker infestations, or spread of those following fire. Decreasers would be things like the viney honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, and autumn olive. If you can get a fire through those, it tends to at minimum top kill them and kind of reduce their population a little bit. And then we see a lot of mixed results with garlic mustard. If it's burned at the right time of year in early spring before seed production, seed set, it can be effective. If it's done a little too early though, before the rosettes are forming, it could really just stimulate seed germination and you get a real heavy infestation. So it is very varied. Another kind of heavy technique that is useful in the fall and winter because you don't have to worry about animal impacts would be forestry mulching. This is using a big machine on a really heavy infestation and just grinding them down to the ground, and then coming back in later, treating the area if there's any sprouts. And so this is one that should be used with caution. It does provide a lot of heavy disturbance. You're grinding and mowing everything down. So it's really suitable for these very dense stands of invasive species and not necessarily just a light infestation. And so you want to maybe consider planting afterwards because you're going to get a lot of sprouts. You're going to get stuff moving in. Planting native plants after you do one of these forestry mulching can be a good way to kind of prevent invasion and afterwards by things like garlic mustard. And then you are going to get some sprouts, so you have to plan to treat those sprouts. So if you get woody sprouts after you cut them, mulch them, or do something like that, you don't want to do it too early. As soon as you see the plants growing, if you treat too early, there's not enough leaf area on those sprouts to take up enough herbicide to kill the roots. So instead, if it's a large shrub, I let those sprouts get up to, 2 feet tall or so before I would spray them. And that'll help you make sure that you've got enough leaf area that you can actually get in there and get enough herbicide down to those roots to kill them. The last little special situation I'll mention on any of these is when you're controlling woody invasive plants, there's a few of them that are particularly a challenge to control. And those are what we call our clonal species. And a clonal species, if you're not familiar with that, is basically a plant that's forms a big network or a patch that's all really the same individual. It's connected underground through the same network of roots. So while it looks like a patch of a ton of plants, it's really just one big plant that's just grown in a big patch. And we tend to see this with things like black locust, tree of heaven, and round leaf bittersweet. And the problem with clonal species, if you damage their tissues, if you cut the stems, cut the trunks, it often stimulates really, really aggressive root suckering. You'll go from having one trunk to hundreds of them, of little ones coming up, and that just makes it difficult to control. So with these clonal species, particularly the three I just mentioned, black locust, tree of heaven, and roundleaf bittersweet, I avoid using cut stump treatments because you're damaging the top of that plant and you're stimulating it to sucker. And the same for the same reason I avoid mowing them or forestry mulching them. Instead, I use things like basil bark, foliar, girdle cuts, injections, things like that that'll kill the plant really without that heavy mechanical damage. So you're killing the plant without first stimulating it to root sucker. You seem to have a lot better success dealing with those, kind of going slow at it than cutting them down. All righty, so I'll end just with a couple more resources and then open it up to questions if you have any. Again, as I mentioned earlier, our extension page, we have a lot of publications and tons of videos on invasive species. It could be a great resource just to learn more about invasives and especially control. Extension actually has a new invasive species website. So it's just extension.illinois.edu/invasives, but it has lots and lots of information about invasive species, both plants, animals, diseases, everything. So it's definitely worth checking out. The Midwest Invasive Plant Network has a page called woodyinvasives.org, and it's a collaborative effort that is called the Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Collaborative. But anyway, the neat thing about this one is it goes into an amazing amount of detail about the different woody invasive plants we have throughout the Great Lakes area, throughout the Midwest, covers the invasives here in Illinois, and not only gives good information about how to identify them, but tons of information about controlling them, detailed guides about how to use all these different treatments that I talked about and others. Really, really, really good wealth of information on that website. It's a great place to go to kind of do a deep dive into all these techniques. And so very, very worth the time to spend the time you spend in there learning about invasive species control. Again, woodyinvasives.org, one of the best websites out there for giving you really, really useful information. Other ones would be the Midwest Invasive Plant Network's control database. This just gives you a chance to type in an invasive plant in there, and then it brings up a whole bunch of recommendations, non-chemical recommendations, chemical recommendations, recommendations that are meant for the novice or experts. Lots and lots of information in there. So it's a great place too, just to kind of get a wealth of information. And kind of the last resource is one if you're really, really nerding out about this and you want to go into a crazy amount of detail about these different control techniques and you want to learn everything you can. My colleague, Dr. Stephen Enlow, who's down at the University of Florida, has a incredibly detailed video series on basil bark treatments, cut stump treatments, hack and squirt treatments, all these different ones out there. And, he talks about each of these treatments for about 45 minutes, shows all kinds of examples, goes into every little bit of detail. And it's a wonderful opportunity to learn a lot about the use of herbicides for controlling woody invasive plants. He's kind of known as the country's expert in this topic. I was fortunate enough to serve as one of the reviewers for this series, and it's one of the best out there. So I highly recommend spending some time and diving deep in here if you're going to be somebody that wants to use some of these techniques. And with that, that's what I've got right there. I'll go ahead and stop sharing. I will open up my video so you can see me again. But I hope that I kind of went into a little enough detail to talk about the considerations when you're dealing with these invasive plants um, in the fall and winter and kind of how that's a little different. So if you have questions, I see Nathan already put one in the chat box. Feel free to put them in the chat box. We're a small enough group, but certainly I think you can also just unmute and talk as well. I'm happy to take questions either way. And Nathan here says he worries about having foliar spray with drift, especially around waterways. Is the risk worth it? That's a fantastic question, Nathan. And I would say that you have to consider each individual situation certainly on its own merits before deciding if it is worth it. I generally use drift. Um, I generally use foliar spray when drift is less of an issue. And so when the plants are smaller, I don't tend to use foliar spraying in high wind situations, in high temperature situations where you'll get evaporation. And I tend to use lower pressure on my sprayers to have bigger droplets so we don't drift as much. When you're working near waterways, I would absolutely make sure that you're using what's called an aquatic safe herbicide. And so some of the herbicides we use have formulations or situations with them that are developed to be safe over water, on water, near water. And so some of the common herbicides like triclopyr, glyphosate, imazapyr that we use for woody plant control all have aquatic safe formulations. And you would certainly want to make sure you're using one of those if you happen to be doing control, near a waterway. And I see Mary sent me a direct message asking how long should we wait after doing after doing removal to plant natives. So she's working on honeysuckle. So it kind of depends a little bit on the individual herbicides you're using. In general, if you're controlling honeysuckle, you're probably using glyphosate as one of the herbicides. The nice thing about glyphosate, it actually doesn't have a long active point. And Mary said she's using Pathfinder. Even Pathfinder, which is I think triclopyr, both of those don't have a long active window in the soil, so um, you can replant almost immediately afterwards, and you won't necessarily impact the plants, the seeds that you're putting in the ground. You will get some sprouts coming up. So what I like to do sometimes is replant with grass species, following a lot of honeysuckle control, some of our native grasses like our wild rice, bottle brush grass, because you're getting something on the ground, you're getting roots in the ground to help prevent erosion. But you can come in with something like Pathfinder, which doesn't really impact native grass, doesn't impact grass species. So you can spray those sprouts even with your plants you planted growing, and it works pretty well that way. Now, if you do put forbs in there, broadleaf plants, then you're going to have to be a little careful when you treat that honeysuckle because those may also be impacted. But in terms of the seeds, if you're using Pathfinder or you're using glyphosate, you can pretty much plant right afterwards and not worry too much about those seeds being impacted. It's a good question.